Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Hector Qirko. He's Professor of Anthropology at the College of Charleston. His research interests include applied anthropology, organizational and institutional cultures, evolutionary theory and cultural patterning, and popular culture and identity. So, Dr. Qirko, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you, likewise, and I appreciate your interest.
Yeah, sure. We're going to talk mostly about, or at least one of the big topics we're going to cover today is the evolution of human cooperation. So, what would you say are the main camps, the main theories in anthropology when it comes to that?
Well, it's a giant subject and it's getting a lot of attention these days. And there are many different kinds of human cooperation, and most of them are not really controversial in evolutionary terms. Um, we have interdependence and mutualism. For example, if we all get rewards only if we cooperate and do something at the same time together, move that tree so that we can get the food underneath it or whatever, it's not problematic. But then there are examples of us uh, expending energy or resources for another at a cost to ourselves. So it would be altruistic cooperation or seemingly altruistic cooperation. And although there are many models that help explain that, inclusive fitness, for example, if we are helping relatives, or reciprocation, direct or indirect, where we might get benefits, and costly signaling might be a part of that reciprocity where we send signals of cooperation, cooperative signals that then bring us rewards. But there is one area in large scale societies in particular that seems to is quite puzzling. And so we have camps associated with trying to understand it in evolutionary terms. And that's when we expend resources for non-kin strangers in anonymous one-shot interactions. And that seems like a very specialized subset of what would be cooperative behavior, except that it happens all the time in large-scale societies. And in fact, some would argue that our greatest cooperative achievements, which are large-scale societies, are predicated on just that kind of cooperative behavior. And so there are two camps. Basically, I'm oversimplifying and leaving out a lot, I'm sure, but I would call the two camps those who believe in genuine altruistic cooperation, that we actually possess predispositions, instincts, whatever, to be altruistically cooperative. And then there's the model that argues that no, we are individually and inclusively fitness maximizers, and we are operating under fitness maximization models. So inclusive fitness, reciprocity, etc., would account for any kind of cooperation that we see in humans. So those are the two big camps, and there's a lot to say about each one of those. But I think the big debate is whether we possess genuinely altruistic cooperative tendencies or if we don't.
Okay, so, but from an evolutionary perspective, do you think that when it comes to getting a complete understanding of human cooperation and its intricacies, do you think that the best framework to do it would be one that is focused on genetic evolution or cultural evolution, or do you think a mix of both, and perhaps one of them would explain better some aspects of human cooperation and the other aspects of it?
Yeah, that's a complicated question.
Yeah.
I personally think that the neo-Darwinian approach, which is to expect that we will be fitness maximizers and that our psychology is so designed for us to make context-related decisions around whom to cooperate and whom not to cooperate, will be the best answer if you take into account that in many cases our psychology around cooperation and altruism are predicated on cues, and because it's based on cues, there can be lots of error and there can be lots of manipulation. And so we see lots of cultural patterning that might result as a consequence of manipulation. And we might see a lot of misfires where we are trying to operate, if you will, as we have evolved to cooperate, only now we're doing it in novel environments, for example, large-scale populations and societies, and it doesn't always fit, it doesn't always work. The other camp, that would be the neo-Darwinian camp that I tend to subscribe to. The other camp would argue that misfires alone can't explain the ubiquity of the cooperative behavior we described, like non-kin, one-shot, anonymous, that makes societies work, and that we need something else to explain that. And most of those theorists would argue it's a gene culture co-evolutionary model, a dual inheritance model, where and often including cultural or genetic or both group selection. So there are various models associated with it, but the idea is that groups outcompeting other groups by being more cooperative and by adhering to cooperative norms over time have, through group selection then, have brought to us that capacity, genetic capacity, at least to some extent, to be genuinely altruistically cooperative. And it's a big mess. Theoretically, it's quite complicated, and there are many researchers working on many areas of that.
Yeah. Yeah, I know that, for example, there are people that say that the best framework to understanding the evolution of human altruism would be through cultural group selection, like Herbert Ginty's and others, right? So,
Exactly.
and I mean, it's interesting because when it comes to group selection, it seems that cultural group selection is not that controversial, but when it comes to applying group selection to genetic evolution, then that's where we get bigger discussions, right?
Yes. To me, and I'm very interested in the theory building that's associated with all of this. I think that we should be cautious when we look for special case explanations for human behavior.
Yeah.
I tend to like the model of the early sociobiologists who argue that people are animals and other species, and all the models that apply to understanding life on Earth should apply to humans, although each species is unique and they will apply in different combinations and in different ways. But we seem to have, culture in particular has led many of us to believe that perhaps we need more. We need unique explanations, even though evolutionary, for our uniqueness as a species. Many argue that we are so cooperative that the standard explanations will not do. I personally think that we should start, because of parsimony, if nothing else, we should begin by seeing if the standard models, the canonical models of inclusive fitness and reciprocity, etc., will help us understand human cooperative behavior, and that we should beware of jumping in, adding additional theoretical models that sometimes might create a house of cards, if you will, of dual inheritance, cultural selection, cultural evolution, etc. Not that they're wrong, but if we don't need them, we shouldn't rely on them.
So in that case, you're not a big fan of group selection, or
No,
are
I
you?
am not. No, I think there are many problems. I was as surprised as anyone when Edward Wilson switched and who had argued against it for a long time and argued
Yeah.
for it. Some of that is hard for me to follow mathematically, et cetera, but it seems to me that the relationship to inclusive fitness and group selection is complicated enough that we may not need to view group selection or multi-level selection on its own as a separate phenomenon. And I think cultural evolution is problematic. I think it's something that we use analogously to genetic evolution. And it's easy to say an institution is evolving or an institutional practice or norms are evolving, but it may not be giving us more information than simply talking about historical culture change. So yes, I'm on the neo-Darwinian camp, in the neo-Darwinian camp.
Yeah. So before getting into specific aspects of human cooperation you've studied in your work, let me ask you, so one of the things I read about in your work is modern intentional communities. So what are these and what can we learn by studying them about human cooperation?
Well, intentional communities, and there are many thousands of them, and they have come in different waves historically, but we're in the middle of another wave, particularly in Europe, but also in the United States, are special purpose communities, people who join together for particular reasons to live communally and to at least to some extent live communally, share property, share obligations, etc. And there are many of them that form around religious motivations. Some of them are forming around environmental concerns. So there are eco-villages, and there are the old-fashioned hippie communes, if you will, of the 1970s, where people come together for shared values and shared way of life. And I think they're a particularly interesting source of information, potentially, about human cooperation because they are forming new communities. We are seeing communities forming in real time. A lot of people who study human cooperation look at hunter-gatherers, foragers, etc., present day, to try to get some information about what it might have been like for cooperation to evolve in the context of similar groups. That's problematic, though, because no forager group is as it might have been. To use these ethnographic analogies is very dangerous. Everybody is impacted by large-scale societies. So while we might get a lot of information that way, we should look for other possible sources of information about cooperative behavior. And intentional communities come together to share, to be cooperative, and create rules and policies to both cooperate and to punish non-cooperators, the free riders, which is, of course, the big problem with the kind of cooperation we've been talking about. We should, in a fitness maximizing model, simply get the benefits and not pay the costs. We should free ride. And so the evolution of cooperation is associated with the evolution of punishing non-cooperators. In intentional communities, we get to see all of that happen in real time. And so I decided to take a preliminary look at intentional communities and the rules they had around punishment of non-cooperators and to what extent they adhered to them by interviewing members of many of these communities and asking them questions about, is free riding a problem in your communities? Do you have rules and policies, norms in place to address free riders? And do you follow them? Do you adhere to them? If it's true that we are wired to cooperate and to punish non-cooperators, then we should see lots and lots of punishing behavior. We're talking about third-party punishment in particular, where people come together to address free riding in their communities. If the neo-Darwinians are correct, then you would think you would tend to see more context-related punishing patterns. In other words, it depends on who you are, what our situation is, what resources we're discussing, etc., rather than like a blanket instinct to punish. And in the little study that I did, I found that the neo-Darwinian model is probably best because although many communities have rules around free riding, very few of them, maybe only half of them enforced them, and other half said it's not worth doing. It actually causes more harm than good to punish the free riders. And even those that do discussed it in contextual terms. In other words, well, if they're older or if they have young children, then we expect less from them. If many different, each according to their ability to give, rather than everybody obey the policy no matter what, etc. it seems like an interesting place through which to examine some of these predictions.
But I mean, through these sort of natural experiments, I think we could call them that, I mean, what we can learn is what exactly? I mean, we can learn certainly more about human cooperation, but can we get or can we use them as sources of data to try to understand how human cooperation evolved? I mean, because I was thinking that perhaps the ecological conditions we're talking about here would not be representative of the ones we evolved in. Right.
They are not, nor are, however, modern day foragers and the other groups that we try to look. In other words, we're going to be approximating whatever we do. But I think it's useful in the sense that both camps of people looking at cooperation and punishment agree that we need more information in the wild, so to speak. We need real life information. There's been a lot of experiments using prisoner's dilemma and other kinds of studies where we find and we look for cooperative behavior and punishing behavior in experiments over amounts of money and things like that, usually with anonymous parties. And we do find that in many of those experiments, people tend to cooperate and punish more than you would expect if you were using the neo-Darwinian model of making contextual decisions to maximize fitness. So people debate the value of those experiments because they are artificial. And many argue that we don't get a lot of information about real cooperative patterns and instincts that we might have from these experiments. And even experiments in the field, which some people have done, are still experiments where people are put into unnatural conditions, if you will, to make decisions about sharing resources, etc. So there is no good way to go. You do want some kind of validity from real life observations. And although, as you say, we're not going to get a lot of equivalence in intentional communities today to ancestral living, we can get some information about the kinds of decisions people make in real life. So I think it's not that good, but it's better than some of the alternatives to explore these issues.
Well, it's what we can work with, right? I mean, it's how science works. So.
You work with the best that you have.
Yeah.
But I haven't seen many people talk about intentional communities in that way. So my contribution that I hope to make was just to bring that up. It's like we should consider these experiments, if you will, real life experiments, as one potential source of data around patterns of cooperation and punishment.
Right. And since you've been talking about punishment, tell us specifically about altruistic punishment. I mean, what is it, how it works, and do you have any theories about how it might have evolved in human societies?
Well, it's exactly what we've been talking about with respect to cooperation. Both of these would be in tandem. In other words, some people are arguing that we have evolved propensities through group selection and dual inheritance, etc., to both cooperate altruistically, in other words, give without expectation of reciprocity or recompense, but also to expend energy punishing non-cooperators without, in other words, we sacrifice resources to punish just as we sacrifice resources to cooperate. So that would be altruistic punishment, just like altruistic cooperation. And again, the many experiments show that people will tend to punish. In fact, you can see it if you look at human behavior. If somebody cuts in a line in front of you to go to a concert, we will get outraged. But studies show that we will also get outraged if people cut in the line behind us, which doesn't impact us. I'm still number 8 to go to the concert. And yet there's a moral outrage, if you will, that we feel when we see people breaking rules, free riding, taking advantage of others, etc. So that would be altruistic. And then the question is it genuinely altruistic? as some of the researchers argue that through group selection we have actually predispositions, instincts to be altruistic punishers, or is it also context dependent and related to particular ecological, resource, relationship, and other parameters? So I feel the same about punishment as I do cooperation, which is it may be that we need these more cumbersome explanations, okay, but we may not, and we should explore the potential of the standard, the canonical models of inclusive fitness, reciprocity, etc. First.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk now about kinship, because that's a very important aspect of human sociality. Tell us about fictive kinship. What is that?
Fictive kinship is a long-standing concept in cultural anthropology, and it is problematic in some ways, but it has some relevance to evolutionary thinking. Mm-hmm. The idea, basically, the etic view of it, or the outsider analytic definition of fictive kinship, would be any kind of relationship that is not through blood or marriage, but is thought of as kinship. So if we identify as kin, but it is neither through blood nor marriage, then that would be fictive kinship. And there's a couple of issues there related to who's doing the deciding. If we look at it from the outside, then we might look at godparenthood, for example, which is common in many societies where you have godparents, as a fictive relationship because it's neither blood nor marriage. However, the members of that community might view it very much as a real relationship, a real kinship, and so it's not fictive to them in that sense. So we need to distinguish between who is doing the deciding as to what is fictive. And because not all societies conform to genetic predictions regarding who will be kin and who won't. In fact, in most of human history, we haven't known enough about genetic relationships to really be able to identify more than close kin as genetic kin in some way. Then all kinship is social in some sense. And fictive kinship would just be one part of that, where the people themselves in whatever community we're looking at understand that it is not real kinship based on whatever criteria they use. It's kind of a convoluted answer, and I apologize. But the idea is, if in your society that is viewed as not real kin, and yet still used, then that would be fictive kinship. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of interest to that, because we find a lot of manipulative behavior associated with assigning people to fictive kinship roles. If you take an example of, I have good friends who have a small child. I'm such good friends that they call me Uncle Hector. And here comes your Uncle Hector, etc. You have set up a fictive kin relationship. Mm-hmm. And the key to kinship is that there are always obligations. There are always reciprocal obligations associated with it. So even though I'm not really Uncle Hector to that child, we have moved our relationship, the parents and myself and the child, to one with more obligations than would be there if I hadn't been named as kin. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of interest to that. And when you consider that we need kin recognition mechanisms, mm-hmm, in evolutionary terms now, to understand who is likely to be kin and who isn't, so that inclusive fitness can operate, then we can study how kinship cues can be manipulated so that individuals feel more like kin in fictive families, and because of obligations are willing to sacrifice more and to commit more resources than they would have ordinarily.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, when it comes to understanding human cooperation through inclusive fitness theory, don't you think, please correct me if I'm wrong here, but wouldn't it make sense to think that if information about who is part of our kin and not in human societies gets transmitted socially, culturally, that would change the dynamics of inclusive fitness or kin selection, because I mean in that way we would be perhaps manipulated is not the best word to use here, but we would be induced in a sense to investing in other people as if they were genetically related to us, even if they aren't.
Yes, yes. And, you know, cultural evolutionists might speak of the evolution of institutions that manipulate kinship, but I don't think we have to do that. I think what we should do is look to see how, in evolutionary psychological terms, humans recognize kin. And there's lots of work around the three main ways in which we identify who is kin and who is not. And one of them is association, especially in early stages of development. In other words, those with whom you are raised are your kin. And now this is evolved psychology and not conscious decision making.
Sure.
But there seem to be strong patterns and a lot of research associated with the fact that those with whom we are raised, we tend to find less sexually attractive because in some sense we are identifying them as kin. There's also much more work around birth order and all of that and identifying who kin might be. But if we leave it at that in general, who you are raised with is one cue to kinship. Another one is phenotypic similarity. To what extent do we look like each other? Which sounds like it wouldn't really apply, but in all societies we find people talking about, hey, your eyes are just like grandmother's eyes, etc. And we do pay a lot of attention to phenotypic similarity, and studies have shown that we tend to do better than randomly in identifying who are kin by phenotypic similarity. And then the third one,
that information, sorry to interrupt, but that
Not at all.
information we also get from other people, right? Because I mean, in our modern industrialized societies, we have mirrors, right? But people in traditional ancient societies didn't. So I mean,
Yes,
they
we
get
have
that
people
information
telling each other.
mostly from others, correct?
Yes, from others. But it may be that we also have, there's depending on the species, there are different arguments about phenotypic similarity. Do we have a model of who we are, and then we see if people resemble us more or less, or do we just look at similarities and try to see? Now, facial recognition and all of that, we have a lot of human brain power associated with recognition, facial recognition, and some of that may be related to that, to identifying kinship. So that's two. And then the third kin recognition cue are kin terms. In other words, when we refer to each other as brother or mother or sister, or others refer to each other that way. Those are the three main means through which, by cues, we know who we're related to. And so the argument you were raising that we can societally manipulate, if you manipulate phenotypic similarity, if you manipulate create settings of close association among people, especially during development. And if you use kin terms to describe relationships, then you are replicating in a way the psychology of how we identify kin. And although you don't fool people into thinking that they are kin to each other that way, you can engender motivations to be more altruistic to people whom you have in that way identified as kin. And I spent a lot of time studying how institutions, no matter where they are, and no matter what their ideologies are, if they are demanding altruism from their recruits, from their members, tend to have institutional practices that are just like that. They tend to use the closest intense association. They tend to use uniforms and haircuts and things that will make people resemble each other as much as possible. And they use kin terms for non-kin relationships. It as means to reinforce the commitment that they ask of recruits for their own purposes.
Oh, that's very interesting. So that would be one of the reasons why people that are part of the same institution, for example, the military, all have the same haircut and dress the same. That would be one of the reasons to manipulate kin recognition.
It's very possible. A lot of I looked a lot at celibacy, institutionalized celibacy, because that is terminal, if you will, altruism from the point of view of the individual. There may be inclusive fitness benefits, but from the point of view of the individual, if you forego reproduction, then there are no benefits that you can receive that will compensate for that loss. Same with suicide terrorism, for example. It's very hard to study it, but if you commit to suicide bombing or whatever, again, there is no way for you to receive rewards that compensate for that. And same in the military, for example, for military sacrifice, for especially the most extreme examples, which is what I looked for to see if the test would work with the most extreme examples of altruism, would be military sacrifice, where you jump on the hand grenade to save others and they are not your kin. And in all of these cases, as best I can tell, and especially with suicide terrorism, it is very difficult to know what training is like, etc. But we find the same model of the three factors that I just raised, the cues that are manipulated, and a couple of additional factors. We tend to prefer young recruits. We tend to separate them from their actual families. Mm-hmm. And then we tend to put them in intense, close association. Monastic orders do it, and convents, etc. But military models are boot camp, and where you are trained in intense circumstances with a small group of people. You are made to look as much alike as possible, even though you're not going outside the walls, for example, of the monastery. People are still expected to wear identical clothing. Some Buddhist robes, for example, the only way you can tell whose is by putting small dots on the sleeves so that you know. And why would you do that if you're all inside a convent anyway, or a monastery anyway, and you're not getting out and need to be recognized? And then kin terms, where we are brothers in arms, we are parents and children, etc., is ubiquitously used. So I think that irrespective of ideology, you tend to find that wherever we see altruism in non-kin settings, altruism for the benefit of non-kin, we tend to find institutional practices that help reinforce that commitment by appealing to these kin cues. Mm-hmm. They're not fooling anyone, and people join for whatever reasons they join, but it's in the interest of institutions to get you to stay and get you to perform your tasks, etc. And so kin cue manipulation induced altruism, if you will, as Robert Trivers would have called it, by kinship deceit, although deceit is too strong a word for what we're talking about. It happens in many species and might be happening in humans as well.
Mm-hmm. So apart from what you just mentioned, what are some of the other things we know about that induce altruism in humans?
That induce it? Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not sure. I have focused on what we can't really induce altruism, but there can be contextual cues that we use in order to reinforce commitment to it. There's lots of things appealing to reciprocity, in other words, to making deals. There's lots of behaviors associated with the expectation you have of receiving benefits in return, and those can be manipulated as well and induced. And so con artists, for example, will manipulate cues that we use to determine the degree to which somebody is trustworthy. And that way they encourage us to give them their money or whatever and then take off. So there's lots of societal manipulation of the basic psychology through which we identify kinship, for example, but also identify trust, the degree to which people can be trusted.
Mm-hmm. When it comes, for example, to the extreme acts of altruism you mentioned in our previous question, I mean, things having to do with the military, terrorist organizations, and religious celibacy, for example. I mean, so the best way of understanding these acts would be through culture. right? I mean, it wouldn't be
Well, it would
biological,
be
or would it have a biological basis
it
as
would
well?
be it would be through the cultural manipulation of evolved psychological cues, I think. Remember that Richard Dawkins, in when he wrote The Selfish Gene, he brought up institutional celibacy, and he brought it up as a reason for why we need the meme. In other words, we can't explain this maladaptive behavior using straight Darwinian models. It's impossible
Yeah.
to explain why many people in many societies, are willing to forego reproduction. Thus, we need to think of the meme and cultural traits that can spread, and all the beauty of mimetic theory is associated with the need to understand that in some way, because evolutionary theory won't account for it. But I disagree. I think that evolutionary theory accounts for it if you understand that culturally people are manipulating its cues, our evolved psychological cues, and causing misfires, if you will, causing errors. The degree to which we cooperate with non-kin as if they were kin, if that's been helped by manipulating cues of kinship, in a way you're engendering a misfire, you're engendering an error. So I think that evolutionary theory still explains it, but indirectly. And we also need to look at cultural patterning and their relationship, and also to better understand what cues are extant and which ones are manipulated.
Yes, I was just trying to say that, I mean, if we try to tackle the question just through, for example, inclusive fitness theory alone without taking into account these cultural inputs, then, I mean, it would probably be impossible, right? It would be an evolutionary puzzle why some people choose celibacy, voluntary celibacy, and, I mean, sacrifice themselves for a military group or a terrorist group or whatever. Right?
Yes, and I should say this doesn't help us understand why individuals would choose to join these organizations. That there are too many cultural and personality and other factors that would account for why any individual would join these organizations. By the way, they're not all voluntary either, so you have to remember in many cases people are drafted into them or whatever. What this does help explain, I think, is how institutions whose interest is in keeping you there and happy and working can help reinforce that commitment. And so it doesn't explain it all. And I don't think we can explain why an individual would join a monastic order. And I don't think evolutionary theory can work at that level of the individual and all the variables that would account for that. But it can help us understand why we might have cultural patterning around things like monastic orders. And by the way, I picked the extreme examples, but it's happening all the time in less extreme examples. You go to the office in many corporations and they are trying to make you be a family. And right, we appeal to, and advertising, etc. We appeal to our evolved psychology. And by the way, don't forget that in many species we see that kind of, Robert Trivers talked about induced altruism in the context of parasites, where they induce, for example, if you think of parasitic birds like the cuckoo or the cowbird, they will manipulate they're evolved to manipulate the cues of kinship that are associated with nests in an egg in the nest, so that host birds will bring up the wrong species, if you will. So we see examples all over nature of manipulation, kin-cue manipulation. I'm just arguing that you see some of that in human cultural patterning as well.
Yeah. And I mean, don't we also have to take into account that, for example, when it comes to religious organizations, there's sort of a class of people that are doing voluntary celibacy, but I mean, the rest of the members there, I mean, people who are not really priests or monks, but just followers of that religion. I mean, the vast majority of them are not celibate.
Of
So,
course.
I mean, we also have to take that into account when it comes to understanding why that institution is still culturally successful. Right?
Yes, and I agree completely. And we then would have to look at the ideology itself and lots of circumstances surrounding why some religions will succeed and some will fail, etc. All I'm arguing is a very modest argument, really, which is institutions will be shaped. The institutional practices, which, by the way, tend to diffuse, like Buddhists, Hindu monastic orders. A couple of individuals looked at Buddhist monastic orders and learned from them, and these traits get passed on. Why these would be used to reinforce the altruism you expect. By the way, I also have found that, not surprisingly, if you look at incipient religious orders, cults and sects, etc., and the beginnings of Christianity and other religions, you find that they do not have these institutional practices in place, but only when the societies get large enough and there are enough non-kin members in association do we have, well, now we need to organize in some way that will be effective, and that's when we appeal to these, well, we appeal to our evolved psychology, perhaps. That's the argument.
In this case, do you think that a costly signaling theory also applies? And in the case of religion specifically, credibility enhancing displays in the case of that class of people that are voluntarily celibate?
Well, I do think costly signaling applies to understanding a lot of religious commitment, and Richard Sosis has spent a lot of time looking at that, and the tasks that you are charged with signal commitment. If you're willing to expend the energy associated with fasting and praying and many of the duties associated with not only in monastic settings, but also just being adherents to religion. Certainly they can serve as costly signals of commitment. I think that's a very good argument. But there's a problem with it when we're dealing with terminal altruism. In other words, a costly signal from a celibate cannot engender somatic and reproductive rewards. Okay. So we would have to try to understand that as either like an extreme case of a pattern that applies elsewhere, but in some cases gets extended, or we need a different explanation. For example, in military organizations, having people jump on hand grenades is not the goal of the military. They do not want military heroic sacrifice. What they want is group cohesion. And so they will use the evolved psychology, as I am arguing, of kin-Q manipulation, along with many other things, to try to engender that commitment. But one byproduct of that commitment might be that in some cases we are so bonded with the kin group that we are willing to sacrifice even our lives for them. So I think costly signaling makes a lot of sense and explains a lot, but it is more difficult to apply to the more extreme cases of altruism. And that's one of the reasons I chose to look at them, because most neo-Darwinian explanations at face value would not apply. There's nothing that can be reciprocated if you killed yourself or if you forego reproduction for a lifetime.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So these are great questions, by the way.
Oh, thank you. So, one last topic then. What is cultural particularism? And is it something that you think still applies within anthropology or not so much nowadays?
No, I think in anthropology, and especially in cultural anthropology, we have a bit of a problem in being a little too particularistic. Much of what we've been talking about today with respect to evolutionary theory, it doesn't apply to that. But the anthropological evolutionary theorists are few in number. And if you look at cultural anthropology as a whole, you will find that the evolutionary anthropologists are a small subset of the main thrust of cultural anthropology. And the way we define anthropology is that we look for similarities and differences, biological and cultural, among human populations, and then, of course, our ancestors and primates, etc. But we're supposed to be looking at both the particular and the universal. We look at the similarities and the universals. I don't think that's the tenor of anthropology these days, and I think we have focused much more on looking at differences and celebrating those differences. Historically, with Franz Boas at the early 1900s, he objected to the 19th century evolutionists, the Spencerian evolutionists, quite correctly as being biased and armchair evolutionists, and argued that we need to be historical particularists. Each culture is unique. It's a constellation of traits associated with diffusion and historical development and chance and interactions with other groups, etc. So each one is unique, historically particular. And of course, much of what we do in anthropology is celebrate the beauty of that particularism, of how many different ways there are to be human, and how many different kinds of solutions we have come up with to deal with human problems. And that's very important. But we're also supposed to be looking at what's universal about us. Is there a human nature? To what extent are we evolved to think in particular ways, to predisposed to lean in certain directions? And might that influence cultural patterning that we see, both in the local and then the larger level? And that, I think, we are not spending as much time on. The reason I wrote a little paper on this, a little commentary, it was because cognitive scientists were asking, are anthropologists going to help us do cognitive science work or not? And what I replied is, I've looked through the web pages, for example, of the top 100 colleges to see how they define anthropology, and I've looked to see how often we find keywords like cross-cultural or universal, etc., in abstracts of presentations at our leading societies, and it's very small minority that are remembering that we should also be looking for the universal. So I think we need that balance. That's what makes anthropology unique, is that we're looking at similarities and differences. And to look only, and even though they're very much worth celebrating and learning from, at differences is not enough. And when it comes to evolutionary, that's one of the reasons I think there's not more evolutionary anthropologists, because they tend to shy away from looking for more universal phenomena.
Mm-hmm. But where do you think this stems from? Is it just sort of an historical accident that the discipline developed in a particular way and people are influenced by the sort of major framework that applies there? Or do you think it's ideological or something else?
I think Franz Boas and the movement of historical particularism, he was very important. And many of the leading anthropologists of his time and subsequent generations have followed that model of how to do anthropology. But I also think there are problems with universalism. Social Darwinism is a very good example, where people have racist and eugenic and other positions that stem from a belief in a human nature. We do this because we are supposed to do this, because that is our nature. And survival of the fittest, which was a term by Spencer, not by Darwin, although Darwin adopted it for a couple of editions of On the Origin of Species, and then took it out because it was tautological. It's circular, it doesn't make sense. That notion of survival of the fittest, I'm rich and you're poor because I'm supposed to be, because I am more fit, all these kinds of models are dangerous. And I think people alarm many anthropologists, and hints of universalism, hints of looking for a human nature, attempts to look at human nature and universal aspects of humanity can sometimes steer too close to those kinds of problematic theories and views. So I think it's a combination of the two.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Dr. Qirko, where can people find you and your work on the internet?
I don't know. I have a web page through the College of Charleston that lists some of my more recent publications. These days, there's those web services like academia, I can't remember the names of them, where you can post your...
ResearchGate, probably.
ResearchGate, etc. I don't know.
Oh,
You can always give me a call, send me an email.
okay, I will be leaving some links to your work in the description box of the interview anyway. And thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. And it was really fun to talk to you.
My pleasure. Also fun, and I really appreciate the interest.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. To keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. Any amount, even $1 per month, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litska and Blanchett Perga, Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Greg Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Vissel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolfkin, Tim Hollis, Henry Kalenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Neuberger Goldstein, Dan Demetriou, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Spinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librand, Oslan Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmides, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litske, Denise Cook, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, and Max Belby. My producers Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Staffiniak, Ian Gilligan, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder. And my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.